let's look at a watershed scale. So we found 2 watersheds in central Illinois, and we wanted to determine if we can get farmers to mass adopt cover crop upwards to 50% of the watershed. Will we see a signal in the water quality? So in this watershed below, it's about 1,100 acres. Watershed above is the control watershed with no cover crops at about 770 acres. Okay, we only cover crop 50% of the larger watershed. And then at the outlet points to this Money Creek, which is a creek that runs to the river system in that region, we had automated water sampling that was occurring that allowed us to understand the impact of mass adopting cover crop on a watershed scale. And so I want to first point out the fact that initially, 15 and 16, we didn't see a signal of increased water quality. And we believed that the cover crop effect had not overcome the legacy nitrogen effect of the nitrogen that was there prior to cover crop being planted. But over time, as the system matured, you see a separation between the black and green dots. Black dots representing non-cover crop control watershed. Green dots is the concentration of nitrogen in the cover crop watershed. So you start seeing reductions. And look what occurred again in 2017, where we had perfect conditions for nitrate loss. Although we have linear increase in nitrate concentration over time as the soil warms up, the nitrate concentration, however, was significantly lower where we had cover crops, where we cover crop only 50% of that larger watershed. So when you think about mass basis or mass loss or loading on pounds per 1,000 gallons per day, okay? We started out again early on, cover crops did not have an impact, but as the system matured, 2018 to 19, we see a 33 to 36% reduction when we cover crop only 50% of that watershed.
So our speaker this morning, I'm very excited to welcome Dr. Mark Armstrong. Dr. Armstrong is an associate professor of agronomy at Purdue University, and he is here to talk with us this morning on his topic is next generation cover crop management. So his presentation today is going to focus on the next generation of cover crop and nitrogen management, which is intended to overcome yield lags for corn following cover crop termination. So he's going to talk about different management practices this morning, including nitrogen application timing, precision planted cover crops, and the inclusion of overwintering legume cover crops. He is a wonderful resource, so I encourage you while you're here this morning with us to not just listen to his presentation, but to use the Q&A feature of the webinar to ask questions, because we will have plenty of time for questions at the end, and we want to be able to answer all of your questions this morning. So thank you all for attending, and special thank you for Dr. Armstrong for presenting with us this morning. And I'll turn it over to Dr. Armstrong now to start his presentation. Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm trying to get to the point where I can share my screen real quick. All right. Okay, I think we're ready. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you and we can see your presentation.
All right. Thank you, Mary, for that introduction. And thank you, Sarah, for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here this morning to share some of my research findings and to talk about next generation cover crop management that will help us close the yield gap for corn following cover crops, and also maintain our water quality ecosystem services. All right, most farmers that I talk to, and I do a lot of work with farmers on farm, they subscribe to this idea of sustainably intensified agriculture. We call it SIA. I also teach this in my course. It maintains the principles of maximum production and profit while maintaining maximum nutrient use and minimizing environmental degradation. Okay. We found that in the literature, throughout research, cover crop inclusion within conventional cropping systems is an aggressive step and an obvious step towards SIA, Sustainable Intensified Agriculture. However, less than 5% row crop agriculture across the Midwest actually, subscribes to cover crop or adopt cover crop. So that's a very low adoption percentage. And I think it's because farmers still have a number of questions economically, a number of questions agronomically. And I'm going to go through a couple that I've heard from farmers. So the first is farmers want to know how much biomass are they generating? How much carbon are they generating with this cover crop adoption and growth? How would the microbes, the soil bugs, respond to this extra carbon and nitrogen being added possibly through cover crop adoption? Should I expect nitrogen immobilization? And can I adjust my management in order to overcome any possible nitrogen immobilization? Those are questions that the farmers are asking. How much nitrogen did I conserve in my biomass? And so one thing to note that if you are planting a cover crop, and let's say you're in the Port of Ohio where you have tile drainage, if that nitrogen is in your cover crop biomass, it cannot also be in the tile drain at the same time. So you are reducing nitrogen loss, you're conserving nitrogen. So that's one question. The next question is how much of the cover crop nitrogen will be of use to my subsequent cash crop? And not only what's the mass or the amount, but what time would that nitrogen release that my cash crop will be able to use it? Another question is, do I need to adapt my management, my fertilizer management with my cover crop adoption in order to, have a system that works together to maximize production, right? Because the bottom line for farmers, they want to maintain or increase their yields, which then advances their profit margin. Okay, so one of the questions that we don't have anymore is if cover crops can impact water quality. We're pretty good at demonstrating this in the literature. So I'm going to go through one study that talks about cover crops and water quality. This was performed in Central Illinois, okay, in collaboration with the Department of Agriculture at Illinois State. It was funded by Illinois Nutrient NREC, okay. And so we were in Central Illinois, and we started this project during the time of the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Strategy when it came out. And we wanted to examine a couple of scenarios of the nutrient loss reduction strategy. Number one, changing nitrogen application from fall to spring obviously should have an impact on water quality. When we move nitrogen from fall to spring and then add cover crops to that, do we get any additional reduction in nitrogen? And this third scenario was not in the nutrient loss reduction strategy, but we wanted to explore it. If we leave the nitrogen in the fall, but strip till and inject anhydrous into a living stand of cover crops, what's the impact of that on water quality and agronomics? So we had 5 treatments, a zero control, which is number 1, 2, and 3. We had a split application of nitrogen with the dominant split in the spring with and without cover crops. 4 and 5, we have another split application with the dominant portion as anhydrous in the fall with and without cover crops. And the cover crops that we used was a mixture of cereal rye and daikon radish. It was an 80%, used more like cereal rye than radish, 80-20 mixture by weight. Total amount of nitrogen applied to treatments 2 through 5 was 220 kilograms per hectare, which is equivalent to about 200 pounds per acre, which is in the region, the actual average amount of rate of being applied to corn. So we did this on a farmer's field. We came in and we tiled his field, and we have 15 individual tile drain plots. And so these red lines are tile drain laterals that are 45 feet apart. This yellow box is the tile monitoring station. the solar power, and we were able to tap into the through the control structure, tap into the water, drainage water, measure it, capture the sample, measure the nitrate concentrations. So therefore, we'll be able to understand the consequences or the results of surface management on tile water nitrate concentration and loading. This is an Amali soil, high organic matter, okay? Average 3.4% organic matter. So I like to show this slide because many times farmers think about research and they're thinking, well, you're probably just hand cranking cover crops on a small area, but actually each plot was about 1.5 acres, okay, which was composed of about 72 rows. We were able to get actual field size equipment through. We contracted with someone that had a Hagee, which was modified for cover crop planting, and we were able to get in standing corn and soybean each year, and we're still doing this. And our seeding rate ranged from 45 to 74 pounds per acre. We started out high, and of late, we're moving to a lower seeding rate, closer to 45 pounds per acre. We're able to get in to seed at about mid-September. So let's look at the cover crop performance. One thing that you'll notice is that we have years on the bottom axis here, the x-axis, and we have kilograms per hectare of biomass. And this blue line represents growing degree days, okay? And there's a mirror between the cover crop biomass and nitrogen uptake. On average, we got about 1,100 pounds per acre of biomass. The range was about 440 to about 1960 pounds per acre. So that's the range over time from 2015 to 2019. Average cover crop in uptake was about 40 pounds per acre, okay, with the range of 15 to 71, depending on the year and the number of growing degree days in the fall and spring. One thing that I want to point out is 2016 and 17 had about the same growing degree days, but we got significantly more biomass and in uptake in 2017. Why? Because a large portion of the growing degree days, the heat units, occurred in the fall, right? And so we got very good fall growth from the daikon radish along with the cereal rye. When the freeze finally came, the daikon radish went to kill, cereal rye continued to grow all the way throughout the spring until termination. And we got really good biomass and record high for my program and about close to 80 pounds per acre of nitrogen taken up in the cover crop, okay? And so I put a star there because we're gonna continue that trend with some commentary around 2017. So what's the impact of that kind of growth on the distribution of inorganic nitrogen? This is ammonium and nitrate, right, in the soil. So on the y-axis, this vertical axis here, you see depth down to about 80 centimeters, which is about equivalent to 2.5 feet, okay? So in central Illinois, at about 3 feet, you start running into the tile drainage. So if nitrogen is at 2.5 feet, prior to planting, then most likely by the time that early seedling gets up and established roots begin to scavenge nitrogen, the corn, it'll be gone. That nitrogen will be gone if it's down at 2.5 feet. Okay, so the green line represents the cereal rye mixture, and the black line represents the control. And you can see a significant reduction, first of all, in the total amount of inorganic nitrogen in the system. Why? Because it has been absorbed by the cover crop, taken up by the cover crop, and assimilated into its biomass, both above ground shoots and roots below ground. Okay, and so the cover crop is doing its job. It's taking up nutrients as it's growing, significantly reducing the amount of nitrogen that is susceptible to tile drainage loss, denitrification also. So when you think about the impact on water quality, so what I'm showing here is the cumulative nitrate load, right, over time. So every time it rained, we added to the graph, okay? The cumulative nitrate load over time from 2014 forward to 2018. And we're continuing this, but this is a very good example of the trends that we are currently seeing. Spring and fall applied nitrogen without cover crops, not that much different. Only about a 9.8% difference between the two. I think that this occurred because we had such high organic matter, right? And so there's a large portion of what we call legacy nitrogen. Nitrogen is there in the soil derived, and when mineralization occurs, that nitrogen is in soil solution as nitrate and susceptible to being lost. And so there was not a big difference when you think about just 4R management alone. But when you add cover crops to that system, despite whether the nitrogen was applied in the fall or the spring, most people can relate to fall applied nitrogen. It could be manure application. That's also comparable to what we're studying here. We saw a 46 to 49% reduction despite when the nitrogen was applied, fall or spring, when we added that cereal radish mixture. Very good reduction. And most farmers ask me, how much cover crop, what type of biomass do I need to have that kind of impact? And so I began to just note this. On average, we're looking at about 1,200 pounds per acre of biomass. And you're thinking about, okay, how do I know when I'm there? We were terminating aggressively 2 to 3 weeks before planting, before the boot stage, okay, before elongation was occurring, okay. Our N uptake above ground was about 40 pounds per acre, okay. And so with only 1,200 pounds per acre, this is not a large cover crop, we were getting 46 to 49% reduction. Now I want to just, kind of pinpoint some of the dynamics throughout the years. And first of all, from 2014 to 2020, you think about flow-weighted nitrate concentration in the tile water. Cover crops always was significantly lower than the non-cover crop concentrations of nitrate in the water. And I want to focus on these red lines that you see at the bottom of the graph, or denoting the time period after the cover crop has been terminated and into the cash crop growing time period, right? Growing zones. And so what I want to demonstrate here is that cover crops have an impact when they're growing and even after they're terminated, because especially cereal with nitrogen, because it decomposes so slowly that it's still affecting the nitrogen that's released into the soil solution that's susceptible to leaching and lost by tile drainage. The next thing I want to point out is this huge spike in nitrate concentration in the year of 2017. Now, this year was the year where we recorded the largest Gulf of Mexico dead zone, okay, down in the mouth of Louisiana. And also in this year, we had really good heat units in the fall. And so the soil never shut down, the soil microbes continued to work, and nitrogen was mineralized from the soil organic matter. You had some people doing fall application of nitrogen. But notice that in this year of a perfect storm for nitrate loss, we got the best growth in our cover crop and the highest in uptake, about 71 pounds per acre nitrogen uptake, and over 2,000 pounds per acre in cover crop biomass. And so great insurance in a perfect year for nitrogen loss, okay? So that was all of the information that I just gave you was on a field scale. But now let's look at a watershed scale. So we found 2 watersheds in central Illinois, and we wanted to determine if we can get farmers to mass adopt cover crop upwards to 50% of the watershed. Will we see a signal in the water quality? So in this watershed below, it's about 1,100 acres. Watershed above is the controlled watershed with no cover crops at about 770 acres. Okay, we only cover crop 50% of the larger watershed. And then at the outlet points to this Money Creek, which is a creek that runs to the river system in that region, we had automated water sampling that was occurring that allowed us to understand the impact of mass adopting cover crop on a watershed scale. And so I want to first point out the fact that initially, 15 and 16, we didn't see a signal of increased water quality. And we believed that the cover crop effect had not overcome the legacy nitrogen effect of the nitrogen that was there prior to cover crop being planted. But over time, as the system matured, you see a separation between the black and green dots. Black dots representing non-cover crop control watershed. Green dots is the concentration of nitrogen in the cover crop watershed. So you start seeing reductions. And look what occurred again in 2017, where we had perfect conditions for nitrate loss. Although we have linear increase in nitrate concentration over time as the soil warms up, the nitrate concentration, however, was significantly lower where we had cover crops, where we cover crop only 50% of that larger watershed. So when you think about mass basis or mass loss or loading on pounds per 1,000 gallons per day, okay? We started out again early on, cover crops did not have an impact, but as the system matured, 2018 to 19, we see a 33 to 36% reduction when we cover crop only 50% of that watershed. So another question that we wanted to answer was, okay, we're getting about 40, 43 pounds per acre of nitrogen in the biomass. Farmers ask me many times, so Doc, when are we going to get that nitrogen back? Because I could possibly use that nitrogen, right, for my subsequent cash crop. And so we had a graduate student, Richard Roth, and he did an incubation study in the lab where he labeled nitrogen that was in the cover crop biomass, added that cover crop biomass to the soil, and then tracked the nitrogen fate into different soil pools. And this is what we found. So let me just explain here what we have. So number one, we have growing degree days 0 to 1,667. Those growing degrees days simulate the average growing degree days of a corn crop, okay? The average heat units that a corn crop would see during the growing season, okay? Now, at 0, that's cover crop cereal termination. Then we got corn planting V6, V3, V6, VT, and then R6 when the plant actually shuts down in black layer, okay? And so we had 4 pools that we were tracking the nitrogen into. Number 1 was the organic soil nitrogen. Number 2 was the soil microbial biomass nitrogen. And then number 3 was the inorganic in nitrogen, and that's what's available to the crop, that's in green. And then the undecomposed component, okay? So it hadn't broke down yet. So when you look at termination, right? At termination, obviously everything is 100% undecomposed. And then by corn planting, we see some decomposition, right? And that stayed constant all the way up to about V6. You see this box here. So from V6 to VT, that's when we saw significant decomposition and nitrogen release. There was a 44% increase in nitrogen release, which resulted into a 41% increase in the organic nitrogen. So organic nitrogen is like proteins, amines, right? It's not available to the crop yet, but it does show that decomposition is occurring. Now, that also equated to about a 4% increase in inorganic nitrogen, right? And so when you progress from VT to R6, finally we find about 33% of the nitrogen in the cereal rye at termination is undecomposed. Okay, so that'll be available for the subsequent crop. 1% was in the microbial biomass. About 53% was in the decomposed, unmineralized end, so in the organic form, not available to plants yet. Only 14%, right, of the cereal rye nitrogen at termination is available in the soil by our R6, okay, crop maturity. So that gives you an idea. In the lab, we determined that you can't really depend on a large portion of cereal rye nitrogen to go to the crop. However, you can depend on a large portion of that contributing to your organic matter. So as we progress, we said, hey, let's do this in the field. Let's label let's use 15N, okay, where we can track this nitrogen into the cereal rye, into the soil, out of the soil, into the cash crop at different growth stages. And let's see if there's some similarity between what we found in the lab versus the field. And this is good information, because what we found was that, again, between V6 and VT and R1, we saw a significant increase in the recovery of that cereal rye into the corn plant and the soybean plant, right? On average, between corn and soybean at crop maturity or at harvest, we see that about 7.3 to 10.1% of the nitrogen that's in the cereal rye plant at termination actually gets into the plant. Okay, so that's not a lot of nitrogen. So a large portion of that nitrogen is not contributing to the plant, the subsequent cash crop, but contributing to your actual soil organic matter that will be available in subsequent years of cash cropping. So overall, I put together this cartoon just to show what we're seeing and what the challenges are, and then we'll go into the next generation management to overcome some of these challenges. When you look at this first bar, right? So above the bold line is plant available nitrogen, below is nitrogen that's lost. Okay, so if you look at this first scenario, this is a non-cover crop scenario. About 72% of the nitrogen is in the soil. The other 28% is lost through the tile drainage. When you add cover crops, you definitely reduce your nitrate loss significantly by 18%. But then a large percentage of what was in the soil now goes into that cover crop plant. The idea is that what's in green, by the time you plant your cash crop, will contribute to what's in brown. Okay, so in other words, you're going to get decomposition and breakdown of that residue, release of that nitrogen back to the soil. But when you have a cash crop, a cover crop such as cereal rye that has a high C/N ratio, we're finding from the last two studies that I mentioned that only about 10% of that nitrogen is available, right? So if you have 40 pounds in the biomass, you're going to get 4 pounds back that's available to your cash crop. So the majority of that nitrogen that was taken up by the cover crop is actually unavailable. So then that leaves us with a 40 to 60 pound per acre of nitrogen management challenge, right? So we grew the cover crop, we're increasing soil health, we're reducing nitrate loss, we're reducing erosion, but then it presents a management challenge because the cover crop is actually doing its job and scavenging nitrogen and nutrients. So when it comes to nitrogen, we have a management challenge. How can we overcome that challenge? Or what's the impact of that challenge on the cash crop? Well, this is a typical year for soybeans following cereal rye, not a big impact, okay? But corn, it depends, right? So these are two years that I've noted. We have several years, but these were typical of most of what we've seen. 2015, we had really good nitrogen mineralization, fast warm up in the spring. And so soil-derived nitrogen was available, and mineralization was able to overcome what the cereal rye took. And there was not a big yield impact, okay? Except for the zero control that received no nitrogen. But in 2017, it was a different scenario. We got really good cover crop growth, and we took up about 70 to 80 pounds of nitrogen. That's a significant portion of what that corn was dependent on to come from the soil, from soil mineralization. So we also had record rainfall in June, and then almost record rainfall in July. So we had a flush of the system, right? So that's 2 strikes, okay? And so also, 3rd strike, don't do this at home. We did not add starter. And this was back in 2017. We didn't add starter to the system where we had cereal rye. We definitely recommend that, especially if you're going corn behind cereal rye. We had reductions wherever we had the cereal rye. So we began to look into what was actually happening. And so we took up a massive amount of corn samples throughout the growing season, V6 to R6, and we looked at the nitrogen uptake in plants that were planted in cover crop residue versus not. And what we found was that at about V12, when the plant is preparing to transition to reproductive growth and to tassel, we saw a gap forming between in the nitrogen uptake between corn grown in cereal rye and corn that did not have cereal rye. And by R6, we quantified that gap, and it was about 60 pounds. Okay, so and that's equivalent to and very close to what the cover crop would take up in a normal year, 43 to 50 pounds per acre. So what the corn is missing is what the cover crop took up. And so now that 60 pounds, again, is what I call a management challenge, right? And so it got me excited. I said, I'm going to tackle this 60 pounds, see if I can get equal or greater yield. So there are 3 methods that we're currently looking at, and all of the data that you're going to see is preliminary. And so the first is a late season application of nitrogen, where we're trying to put back the nitrogen that the cover crop took. Okay, and we're looking at the agronomic and environmental impacts of that. Precision planting cover crops, planting cover crops where you have non-intersecting interactions of the non-intersecting growing zone of the cash crop and growing and the cover crop. And then we have the introduction or the inclusion of overwintering legumes, okay, which is, I think, could be a money-making practice if we can manage it correctly. So let's go into this late nitrogen application. So this is a busy slide. I'm gonna walk us through it. So first of all, we have 5 treatments, a zero control that receive no nitrogen, a regional control. So this is what the farmer was doing when I got there, when I began to collaborate. It's adding a total of 225 pounds per acre. It's putting 120 as anhydrous in the fall, 5 in the row, okay? 5 pounds in the row as starter, and then he's coming back with 100 pounds of side dress. Regional control plus cover crops, we just added cover crops to that. Adaptive 1, the idea here was we wanted to determine and be a little aggressive, okay? And to say, okay, we got 3.4% organic matter, long-term cover crop in this system. Could we depend on that organic matter to supply enough nitrogen to hold the plant over until we do a late season wide drop at about V8 to V10 timing, okay? But we kept the total nitrogen rate the same. Adaptive 2, we were even more aggressive, but in the other direction. We put 120 in the fall, 5 in furrow at starter, and then we did 85 at side dress and came back with 75 at wide drop, V8, V10, which gave us 60 pounds more in our rate from 225 pounds to 285 pounds. We replicated this 3 times. So let's look at some of the results. Here's a aerial image showing those green, so those red squares or rectangles are where we had the zero control, no nitrogen applied. Those dark green, okay, this is at V10, those dark green rectangles that with the circles around them represents where we did the wide drop with 28 at V10. Okay, so we were greener later. Most of the time, that means good news. Okay, so here's what we have. We go back to that same table that's busy, and I'm gonna walk you through. So basically, what we saw, if you look below the bold line, we had, so when you look at the regional control, corn in uptake was about 264 pounds per acre. And then we decreased as we had cover crops. We decreased again, so the soil was not able to hold us over. We skipped the side dress and added nitrogen late, thinking that the soil would be able to hold us over. It did not. Okay, but when we did side dress and put an extra 60 pounds, which represents the amount of nitrogen that the cover crop normally takes up and scavenges, we had significantly more in uptake in this treatment relative to the regional control that had no cover crops. The same trend applied when you think about corn yield. Okay, regional control, what the farmers doing before I got there, 223 bushels per acre. Once you move and add cover crops, we had a significant reduction to 215. More reduction when we tried to play with the V6 versus V10 nitrogen application. But then we had greater, about 4 bushels greater relative to the regional control for the adaptive 2, where we had 60 more pounds added, right? And then when you look at adaptive 2 versus adaptive 1, significant increases among cover crop treatments. Now, here's the thing, the weakness of this is that we were not able to add, we didn't have enough room, enough land to have enough plots to add that 60 pounds of nitrogen to everything across the board to see if just the system was nitrogen deprived. But it is good to see that we can manipulate management and get significantly more yield in a system with corn following cereal. Additionally, one surprise water quality wise was that adaptive 2 received 60 more pounds per acre of nitrogen, but maintained a 45% reduction in nitrate loading relative to the control and other cover crop treatments, right? And so basically what I'm stating is that in this cover crop system, we added 60 pounds more nitrogen, but we still get the same nitrogen loss reduction relative to the control with no cover crop. That is significant. Another point before I move is that possibly we can optimize this 60 pounds. Maybe 40 pounds would have done it, would have put us over and allowed us to have equal or greater yield. We don't know. We're continuing to study this to optimize that nitrogen management. The next thought is to do precision planted cover crops, okay? So instead of full width drilling after harvest, let's do precision planted cover crops. And I'm collaborating with the group out of Southern Illinois, and we are basically establishing plots all across the Midwest to see, with different hardness zones, is this a viable practice in order to get equal or greater yield with less seed applied, but precision planted seed. So the idea is that a farmer would come out after harvest and then after cash crop harvest with his drill, and then plant strips of cereal or cover crops across the field while leaving the corn row. Okay, we're calling it a skip row or the corn growing zone. So therefore you have non-intersecting growing zones of cover crop and cash crop, right? It gives you flexibility and termination. Let's say you have a clover and you want to let it go, you can plant and let it go because you have individual growing zones. You have that corn planted, that skip row, just waiting for you to come and plant in the spring while you manage your cover crops. Okay, it could reduce nitrogen immobilization, meaning that we get in the cover crop effect where the corn plant will not be planted, right? So you don't have any roots growing in that corn growing zone. Maybe a little, a couple of roots make it to that center, but not the mass that you would get where we actually planted the cereal or the cover crop seed. You could increase your spring warm up, right? Because that that non-cover crop zone where the corn will be planted or the soybean will be planted, it doesn't have that canopy that reduces evaporation, that keeps the soil wet and cool. And so you're warming up, and you might be able to get in the spring and plant with your guidance, your precision guidance, to hit that zone, and then deal with your cover crop before or after you plant. Okay, potentially you can increase the profit margin because you're reducing the actual rate and mass of seed that you're planting per acre, because you're not planting the 100% of the surface area. You're stripping, and we're dealing with only 50% of the surface area where we're planting the seed. So let's look at some preliminary results. So what you see here in this table is, let's look at the biomass, okay? This is biomass accumulated in kilograms per hectare. This is the control NP, and this is the strip CRI, okay? Identical, very, very similar biomass, okay? Also, when you think about the nitrogen content in the biomass across years and site years, we saw basically the same nitrogen content. So that means that potentially with 25% less seed in this case, we get the same biomass production, we get the same biomass carbon, right? That's going to contribute to soil health, possibly the carbon market, who knows? And you're getting the same N uptake. So thus you're probably getting the same ecosystem service as far as reducing nitrate loss, okay? But with 25% less seed. So this is 1 year of yield from this study, and we're going to have the second year in a couple of months, right? And so we see 3 treatments: the control with no cover crop, drilled cover crop, full width, right? 100% of the surface area, and then precision. Despite N rate, if you compare the control to precision, we had equal or greater yield, okay? But when you compare precision versus drill, the 2 cover crop CRI treatments, you always had greater yield where you had precision planted cover crops, despite the nitrogen rate, okay? Again, this is with 25% less seed, equal greater yield as far as corn relative to the control, okay? And this is when you do precision planted cover crops. The last practice is the inclusion of overwintering legumes. So CRI is key in the Midwest because it's able to overwinter. You can plant it late and still get good growth in the spring, making significant advances in soil health, significant advances in erosion reduction when we get these spring rains, okay? However, we do struggle with corn behind CRI, depending on who's managing, right? So we wanted to find, is there an alternative that could help us with a nitrogen credit? So we're looking for overwintering legume. And so the idea here, we were playing with Balanza clover, fixation, Balanza clover. And as you can see, this is May 12th, and we're doing a biomass sampling. We got, first of all, this is in southern Indiana, okay? And so there's a winter there, but it's milder, so it gets more harsh as you move north, of course. But the fact that this Balanza clover, which is a legume, was able to overwinter, right, was significant. So this was the first year we actually did this 2 years. I'm going to show you pictures and data from 2021. We were able to get this to overwinter. That's significant. And when you see that biomass, the nitrogen there, some of it is scavenged, but most of it is fixed symbiotically from the atmosphere. So there's a possible, very possible nitrogen credit here if we can perfect the management. So great potential here with this above ground biomass from Balanza clover. Okay, you're actually getting that soil health. You can see the roots, you can see the earthworms there, you can see the nodules also. That's where the fixation, that's nitrogen fixation is occurring. Okay, so let's look at the cover crop performance. We have Balanza clover, we had the control, this CK, that's the check. So this is the weed population. there. This is again a lot of heat units in southern Indiana. Okay, and then this is hairy vetch, crimson clover, right? You can see significantly more biomass for the Balanza clover. Thus, okay, what's in that biomass? Nitrogen content, carbon content. How does that compare? C/N ratio. Okay, so when you think about what's in the biomass, carbon-wise, there's significantly more carbon in the above ground biomass for the Balanza clover. It's obvious here, right? So we're talking about 25 to close to 3,000 pounds per acre of carbon, not biomass, carbon, right? Now the question is, and we're studying this, what's the fate of that carbon? How much of it is going to emit to the atmosphere as CO2? How much of it converts to the soil organic matter that increases your soil health, right? Let's move to this blue graph here with the blue bars. This is the biomass nitrogen, right? Significantly more nitrogen in the Balanza clover relative to another legume, which is crimson clover. Crimson clover had about 50 to 100 pounds per acre of biomass nitrogen, which is decent. But then Balanza clover that has significantly more biomass, more growth, vigorous growth in the spring, we got, let's say 200 to almost 260 or so pounds per acre of nitrogen. Now, again, that nitrogen is in the biomass, we measured it, but what's the fate of it? How much of it will be used by that crop? And so we're studying that, okay? But we were able to see the potential of Balanza clover relative to the crimson clover. Here's another key point that we recorded and observed. The biomass C/N ratio, which is an indicator to how fast the biomass will break down in the spring as the soil warm up, right? How well would the microbes be able to decompose that biomass and then release that nitrogen for the subsequent cash crop? When you look at, see, this is the C/N ratio of the weeds in the control. So 20 to almost 27 to 1, okay? Carbon to nitrogen in the biomass ratio. But look at the Balanza clover relative to hairy vetch, which is a legume, relative to crimson clover. An average, well, a range of about 10 to 12 C/N ratio. That's really significant. That means that biomass should be breaking down fairly quickly, right? Because it's so nitrogen rich and microbes love that. So we got greater biomass, greater N uptake, and a lower C/N ratio. I really like what I'm seeing with this Balanza clover. Okay, here's 2020 yield. And so just let me preference this. On the horizontal axis here, you see basically the side dress in. All plots received 40 pounds of nitrogen at starter, right? And so with just 40 pounds of nitrogen at this zero and zero side dress, we have about 52 more bushels to the acre for Balanza clover relative to the control, and the crimson clover. Then when you had about 65 pounds added as side dress along with that 40 pounds at starter, the gap closes, but you still have a significantly greater yield of about 18 more bushels relative to crimson clover. And then as you increase the side dress, that advantage goes away. And the MRTN for all of the treatments, economic N rate was about 160 or so pounds per acre. And so this shows great potential, because if you can get 52 more bushels you can get 152 bushels of corn following this Balanza clover, and you only added 40 pounds at starter, we can definitely manipulate this management, adapt this management to try to reduce our N rate, right? And use some of that nitrogen credit from the cover crop. So let's look at 2021. And I really begin to capture the progression of this Balanza clover over time, this overwintering legume. And this, at the top, you see a progression of pictures and dates for southern Indiana. At the bottom, you see a progression, that same progression for central Indiana, central Illinois. right? And so one of the things that we learned is that if you're going to use Balanza clover, you have to be patient. I had a couple farmers just decide, Doc, I don't see it. I see more weeds than I see clover. So I'm going to go ahead and terminate the whole field. And I said, hey, I beg you to be patient, but it's your field, right? And so what they were looking at are those April dates and on early March dates, right? Where you basically see nothing, almost no evidence of that clover. Then as time progressed and we get to the latter part of April, despite the location, you see the Balanza clover comes on very strong and begins to establish canopy, and will begin to smother those weeds out. And again, if you get over 1,000 pounds of biomass, you have the potential, according to the literature, to have a nitrogen credit. Okay, so let's look at some of the performance. That's another picture of what it looks like when we went to sample. I mean, that's a lot of biomass. So I want to stop right there and point out that you got to think about how you're going to plant into that biomass. Your trash whippers, how you're going to close the seed slider. You're going to make sure you get your depth right, your down pressure. All of those things you have to adapt when you have a cover crop like this growing in your field. So let's look at some of the performance of this Balanza clover and cereal rye. So this is in southern Indiana, okay? A lot of heat units down there. And so what we saw was the Balanza clover did very well, over 4,000 kilograms per hectare of biomass. And when we did precision planted with 50% less seed, we got about the same biomass. So we could see less. We can see less seeds to the acre and get similar biomass. So that's saving on cost. Okay. When you look at the cereal rye in that same field with 50% less seed, we got about equal biomass. Okay. And so we can cut back on the cereal rye seeding rate and get about the same biomass, same carbon, same N uptake. That's significant. Now that's in southern Indiana. Balanza outgrew cereal rye. Okay. But then when you go to central Illinois, it reverses, right? So it's colder. So the Balanza range from about 1,000 to about 1,200 kilograms per hectare of biomass. Again, with 50% less seed, we still got close to the same biomass, okay? Cereal rye did better. It's colder. It continued to grow, right? Because it's more winter hardy, right? And we got about 25 to 3,000 kilograms per hectare of biomass. With less seed, we actually did better. I think it's because of less competition, more sunlight coming from more angles, generating that growth. Okay, so I'm going to close out now and then take questions. Okay, so one of the things that we learned initially, right now during this preliminary stage, is that we can include overwintering legumes. If we be patient, we can generate a significant nitrogen credit. It's going to take more management, more precision in our management to get that done. Precision planting cover crops, you're getting a lower seeding rate per acre, right? Lower mass of seeds planted, but you're getting equal or greater biomass. So therefore you're getting equal or greater carbon generated in that biomass and nitrogen uptake. And we are seeing equal or greater yield. We also determined that we can replace the cereal rye nitrogen, get greater yields and not lose any nitrogen and then reduce the same amount of nitrogen that's lost in the tile drainage. That's very significant. Okay, we want to optimize that system. Maybe we don't need the entire amount of 60 pounds per acre. Maybe we can come back with 40, 45 pounds and then generate greater yield without losing that nitrogen, right? So that's significant because remember that the majority of the nitrogen that the cereal rye scavenges, it goes back into the soil matrix, the soil organic matter, to be released at a later point in subsequent years. So with that, I'm going to stop and take questions.
That was a great presentation, Shalimar, with a lot of good information. We've got quite a few questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
So let's get started with those. The first one, did you observe any differences in weed control in the precision planted versus drilled cover crop?
Very good question. What we saw early on is that there were less weeds, and we didn't quantify this. And so I'm working with a great weed scientist, Bill Johnson at Purdue. We're going to start quantifying this with a couple of graduate students, but just visual. We saw less weeds early with the full width drilled cereal rye or cover crops. And then when it comes to later in the season before termination, we begin to see the canopy close for the precision planted, and it began to smother weeds at that point. So probably overall, we saw probably greater weed pressure with the precision planted cover crops, but we are devising some management for that. Maybe an application of herbicides prior, and then come back and plant the cover crops in a precision manner. We're working on that part of the management. But after the canopy establishes, we saw weed reduction in precision.
Okay, I think that answered that one pretty well. Next question looks like, could much of the corn yield increase in the precision planted rye system be from the reduction of the allelopathic effect and or disease impact that the rye roots may have on the corn? And what other factors do you feel are contributing to the increase in corn yield?
Very good question. Just of late, we had a colleague out of Iowa to produce a paper that showed that precision planted cereal rye reduced fusarium and root rot diseases for corn. So in other words, as you reduce the density and the distance of cereal rye from the corn row, you reduce the incidence of root diseases for corn. Allelopathic chemicals are very difficult to measure because they're fleeting. They do not last long in the soil, so it's hard to measure those. So I have no data on that, but the literature does say it's difficult to measure. It could be happening, but I think disease, we have quantified that and published it, the group out of Iowa. And so I think that's one key factor. The other key factor is just physically, you're warming up faster. So I didn't show this data, but across all of our sites, we did soil temperature at planting. And for cereal rye, we saw a significant increase in soil temperature where we planted in the precision planted cereal rye versus the conventional planted cereal rye. So there's a physical component. Thirdly, I think that there is a nutrient uptake component where you have less immobilization of nitrogen occurring where the corn plant is actually planted. And so, for example, more of that starter nitrogen could be taken up by the plant relative to when you have cereal rye planted right next to that residue, like in the corn planting zone, that holds about 300 pounds per acre of new carbon that's going to generate microbial activity, which could generate immobilization. So I think that there are three things that are happening there so far.
All right. The next couple questions both deal with the Balanza clover that you talked about. The first one just asks, when typically was the Balanza clover planted?
So typically, in southern Indiana, September 11th, we planted. And then in central Illinois, where it's cooler, we planted after harvest 9/23. So September 23rd. We planted at a rate of 8 to 10 pounds per acre, but I believe you can reduce that according to the data.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the next one, were slugs an issue with the Balanza clover?
I did not see an issue with slugs. However, I saw an issue with voles, right? Now, here's a theory. I saw an issue with voles where we had the conventional planting, conventional drilling, right? Full width drilling across 100% of the surface area. What that does, once that clover established canopy, the voles can move along the soil surface without being spotted by area predators like hawks and owls. But if you precision plant, right, you leave some area where there's no cover crop, and prior to canopy establishing, those voles are exposed as they're moving around because there's some areas that have no cover crops, and I believe that could increase the efficiency of the predators to control that population. So it was funny. We really saw vole pressure where we had really high biomass on the conventional drill, but we didn't see it as much in the precision. And we want to quantify that. We want to have some wildlife scientists to come to help me quantify that impact and to develop management on how to reduce vole pressure.
Okay. The next one, long-term, what happens to potential nitrogen loss as this biomass converts to organic matter and then onto available nitrogen? And then it says you're applying similar or greater nitrogen in the present. Is that going to come back as potential nitrogen loss later?
Great question. So in my oldest system, started in 2014 to current, and throughout all of those years, we've saw greater loss where we didn't have cover crops, and we have had no less than 35 to 40% reduction of nitrogen loss through the tile relative to the control over those years. It's funny that some years we got less than 1,000 pounds per acre of biomass, but we still got the reduction. And so what I'm thinking is happening is we're adding so much nitrogen to the organic matter and so much carbon to the system that's causing the nitrogen cycle to basically causing there to be more coupling between carbon and nitrogen, slowing the cycle down, changing the structure. And thus we're seeing a consistent reduction across time. We even saw it in the watershed. When we first planted cover crops in the first year on a watershed scale, we saw more loss in the cover crop watershed. But over time to current, we are seeing reductions as that system matures. Now, let's speak to the long term about nitrogen release. There was a paper just produced out of Kentucky that showed that long-term no-till, it did not allow you to apply less nitrogen. So you got the same economic nitrogen rate for optimum yield. However, at that rate, they measured greater nitrogen mineralization in the no-till plot versus the conventional till, and thus saw greater yield at that MRTN rate. So that lets me know in a system, and this is in Kentucky, so there's more heat units there. The growing environment is different than Ohio, Indiana, so forth. However, it is evidence that long-term, the organic nitrogen that you build up in the soil with a no-till or a high residue system has the potential in the right growing environments to release nitrogen. You might not be able to cut back on your rate, but you get more yield at that rate, which could lead to profit.
This webinar is part of a 3-week summer series that we're trying out focusing on cover crops. And this is part 2. I have the recording from part 1 up on our YouTube channel, and I'll be sending you all the recordings for each webinar, as well as the PowerPoint slides. I want to remind you that next week is our last session. Next week, we will have a panel discussion with Dusty Sonnenberg, Aaron Heilers, and Luke Van Tilburg. And that's going to be on Thursday, August 5th at 8 a.m. for 1 hour of nutrient management CCA credits. And we do have that registration up and available. So if you're interested, please go ahead and register for that anytime.